Hey everybody, Chad here. If you'd like to follow me on social media, you can find me on TikTok and Instagram under the Gnostic Astronauts podcast. And if you'd like to check me out on the platform formerly known as Twitter, you can find me under Chad Atkins2341. Now get ready to open your mind. In 1957 and 1958, the nations of the world got together under the guise of science to measure every square inch of this planet. It was called the International Geophysical Year. But I think that this may have been a global contact event.
I think it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder, and finally it's going to be so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is.
Then we're containers. That says supposedly the aliens look at us.
It would be a shift in the knowledge of humanity, new knowledge.
What the hell is going on?
If there's one thing that makes history painfully clear, it's this. Our churches, governments, and ruling institutions have never been in the business of expanding our reality. In fact, they've been more in the business of managing it. For thousands of years, every time humanity has brushed up against some new truth, there is this huge power struggle. The powers that be will never surrender their worldview willingly. Or maybe I should say, our worldview. Because those type of systems are built upon what we all collectively believe to be true. And if we change our minds, eventually they will have to change too. And that's why it's important to be continually upgrading our worldview and views on reality. When you look at it from that perspective, it kind of shows you what a bad idea it is to hold on to some old belief when there's new evidence that proves otherwise. And we can see this pattern played over and over again throughout history. And it usually has to do with some new type of idea breaking out. Of course, the go-to example of this in history is 2,000 years ago. We can all argue whether Jesus existed or not and how much of that story is true. But one thing is clear. There was a huge societal change. They changed what they understood reality to be. The Roman Catholic Church rose up and stagnated knowledge for 1,000 years. And it wasn't until about the 1300s that they began to break out of that stagnation. And that time was called the Renaissance. It's a French word that means rebirth or born again. You know, when you think about just the very idea of being born again, what is it? Really, it means upgrading your consciousness. And that's exactly what the Renaissance was. An upgrade in consciousness. And the way they upgraded their consciousness was with technology. Because in the 1400s, that's when they invented the internet. Or I mean, the printing press. But really, that's what the printing press was. It was a primitive version of the internet. When you think about what it did to society, for the first time, people could mass produce any type of idea they wanted to. Now, it may have got them killed, but still, they would have printing presses even in hideouts, and that they would print stuff and pass them around in secret so people could read about new ideas, new ways of seeing reality and just who we are. And entertaining thoughts like that are very dangerous to the power structures that are built on top of these ideologies. If you think of ideas like stones in a foundation, how many of them do you have to remove before the entire structure crumbles? Sometimes you don't have to take out that many stones to collapse a structure. All you have to do is take out a few key stones. Or you could take out a keystone. Now, a keystone is what the Romans would use when they would build these huge arches for their aqueducts. And the keystone is the wedge-shaped stone at the very top in the center of the arch. And all the other stones are leaning inward. And without that keystone in place, they will crash to the ground. So the keystone is the final critical piece that secures the entire arch. And so in society, there are many keystone-type ideas that I don't think we realize how much they're holding this entire structure together. And throughout history, they had a name for when these keystone-type ideas get removed, and they're called revolutions. And during the Renaissance, there was a book written about revolutions that would eventually change the world forever. It was written by a guy named Copernicus, and it was about planetary revolutions, and it would eventually cause a revolution in society itself. And the title of this book was On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. So Copernicus, he was an astronomer and a church official, and he believed that God designed the entire cosmos with symmetry. And as an astronomer, they had an accepted way of looking at how the universe worked. And it was something called the geocentric model, invented by an Italian mathematician, Ptolemy. And this model said that the Earth is stationary and unmoving. Basically, the entire universe revolves around the Earth. And that just so happened to line up with different verses in the Bible. One of them is Psalm 93. The world also is established that it cannot be moved. Literally, I guess. Well, at least that's what they thought. So they didn't think that Earth was a planet. They saw the Earth as unique, and it was the immobile center of the universe. But Copernicus found this way of viewing the universe, and reality, was mathematically clumsy, and he believed that the universe should be simple and elegant, and it should reflect that in the mathematics itself. So he tried different models, and he found that when he put the sun at the center of the universe, it just made everything else make sense. It cleaned up the orbits, and it allowed him to accurately predict the equinoxes, the solstices, and the exact date of Easter, which, under the geocentric model, they never were able to do. It was always within a few days or so and was very clumsy. And back then, to even consider the idea that the Earth revolves around the sun and that the sun isn't the center of the universe, just to consider or entertain that idea is true, meant that you were implying that the church was wrong and that their version of reality is not true. And to see the Earth as a planet just like any other planet, it meant that we weren't so special and that we were subject to the laws just like every other planet. And back then, a thought like that was heresy. Now, some describe this revelation that the Earth is a planet as one of the most humbling insights in human history, that it redefined our place in the cosmos, and it was a direct consequence of facing the uncomfortable truth of the Copernican model. Now, Copernicus was no dummy, and he was well aware of the implications of his model. So he just talked about the math around the model. And from what I understand, they would put the sun at the center of the universe because it made the math work better. But they were careful not to translate that into an actual reality. And that's called mental gymnastics. Or back then, it was called staying alive, because talk like that would get yourself killed. So Copernicus never officially published his work until the year he died in 1543. And that's when his book on revolutions of planetary spheres was released. Now, at first, his book was not taken as literally true. It was seen as a type of fictional math that gave better predictions of the planetary positions, especially compared to the old model. So they used it for computation purposes, while still believing that the Earth was stationary and at the center of the universe. But after a while, it got harder and harder for people to just treat that math as fictional, and the church started waking up and realizing that that may be a keystone type idea. So in 1616, the Catholic Church put the book on revolutions of planetary spheres on the forbidden book list. Yup, they got canceled. Now you would initially think, well, they can't keep that idea out of the public for that long. For crying out loud, they admitted the math worked and used it. And it's true. They did eventually cave in and admit that they were wrong. In 1822, that's when the church officially permitted heliocentrism to be taught as true by Catholic scholars. But it wasn't until 1835 that the last formal bans on the books were lifted. So it only took almost 300 years. And that just goes to prove the point that power never surrenders its worldview willingly. It has to be pulled out of their cold, dead hands. Nowadays, we look back on that time in history, and we call it the Copernican Revolution. It's seen as a type of threshold that humanity crossed that started an upward trajectory in knowledge and understanding of reality. And when we look at it from the 30,000-foot view, we see that age-old pattern. Somebody discovers something new about reality that challenges the old system, and they just keep it to themselves as long as they possibly can. Meanwhile, using whatever new knowledge or technical advancement that they have for themselves. Nowadays, we would call that as classified or need to know. Maybe black ops programs. Really, those types of labels should send shocks through society, but we're told it's for our own safety. So we don't question it. Now let's look at our modern times. Let's say the past 100 years. I wonder if there would be any events in which scientists would declare we've discovered something as monumental as the Copernican revolution. Well, there is. And it's called the International Geophysical Year.
From the White House, an announcement and a beginning. President Eisenhower heralds man's most concerted effort to learn about the place where he lives. 64 nations are cooperating in the unprecedented undertaking.
July 1st marks the beginning of one of the great scientific adventures of our time, the International Geophysical Year. The scientists of the United States will join their efforts with those of the scientists of some 60 other nations to make the most intensive study ever undertaken of our planet. The scientists tell us that they cannot possibly anticipate all of the valuable scientific knowledge that will result from their efforts. They believe that many of the facts thus acquired will give us new understanding and new power over the forces of nature.
Now, this was a project of the scientists of the world over an 18-month period in 1957 and 1958. 64 nations took part, and they agreed to share data in order to help progress humanity. And on December 1st, 1958, the National Academy of Sciences held a meeting at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. And a guy named Dr. Hugh Odish, who was the executive director of the U.S. National Committee for the International Geophysical Year, gave a speech. At this time, the project was about 4 weeks away from being officially done, and the speech Dr. Otish gave was entitled The Meaning of the International Geophysical Year. Now, in this speech, he gives all types of pleasantries and formalities. He kind of brushes over the different type of scientific experiments that they did and how they're on the cusp of new discoveries thanks to this collective working together of world scientists. But in that speech, he's trying to describe to everybody what a monumental moment of time in history this is, of what they have just accomplished. And this is how he describes it. He says, the I.G.Y is the single most significant peaceful activity of mankind since the Renaissance and the Copernican Revolution. Wow, that's quite the statement. And then a little later on in the speech, he says this, we can see that the Copernican astronomy achieved not alone a revolution in science, but changed man's concept of man, of his religion, and of his philosophy. And the impact of the heliocentricity was felt over the course of several generations. He then goes on to say, the onset of the space age affords the possibility of a comparable impact. He then says, space has no meaning unless realizable, and it's now being tangibly within reach and is intellectually and emotionally comparable to the impact from the findings of Copernicus. To be at the threshold of an age which releases man from the confines of his ancestral, primordial, planetary home is no small matter. And that right there is what the International Geophysical Year was all about. Man getting ready and measuring every corner of the earth so that we would be able to go to space. Or at least, that's the official story. And then Dr. Otish ends his speech with a warning. He says, provided that the complexity of modern society does not hide what is at hand, and that the destructive forces present in our day not only do not eliminate civilization, but do not, by their necessary insistence upon man's attention, mask the wonders of Earth and the universe. And provided that the teachers and poets, scientists and philosophers sense the possibilities, there is at hand an unparalleled situation for stimulating the best in man. To me, he's saying to the government bodies, we are finding some very new, interesting stuff out about reality, and you better not hide it from everyone. But let me ask you this. When you think of entering the space age, do you first think of the International Geophysical Year? I.G.Y for short. I know I don't. Which, considering how much of a monumental historical event this is, I find that kind of strange. For the past 20 years or so, I've just loved digging into history, especially in the early 1900s and during and after World War II. And considering that Dr. Otish said the I.G.Y is the single most significant peaceful activity of mankind since the Renaissance and the Copernican Revolution, I find it kind of strange that I hadn't heard of it before, if it's such a big deal. Now, in the last episode I did, talking about Eric Hecker, Antarctica, direct energy weapons, and the breakaway civilization, I touched on the International Geophysical Year. And because there's not a ton of information about it, and even a search on YouTube turned up hardly any informative videos, it got me kind of curious. And especially when I read the line in Dr. Otish's speech about how this is the single most important thing to take place since the Renaissance and the Copernican Revolution. When I read that, I thought, wait a minute. That sounds like the I.G.Y is a BFD, if you know what I mean. Now, the I.G.Y in a nutshell was a project of the world, and it ran for 18 months, from mid-1957 to the end of 1958, and 64 countries took part in it. It was something like 60,000 scientists, and the idea was that they would all share data, and for the first time, global coordinated observation and mapping of the Earth, from the ocean floor to atmosphere to cosmic rays, seismology, magnetism. It was an effort to map our planet in every way possible. And the fact that they did this in the late 50s, at the height of Cold War tensions, is kind of unbelievable, really. That the Soviet Union and the US are all of a sudden gonna get along. And even though they're threatening to nuke each other, they're all of a sudden gonna share data and work together. Well, that's what they sold to the public. That this was peaceful and scientific efforts mapping the entire planet. You know, that almost sounds like world peace, which to normal people like you and me sounds amazing. But how does that sound to Department of Defense companies, to elites who make money off of war and global instability? I guarantee you that that very idea makes these people very nervous. That's the kind of idea that can knock ideological keystones out of their place and cause entire systems and structures to collapse, if you know what I mean. Now, historians look at the I.G.Y as a moment when humanity collectively began to observe Earth from the outside. And it laid the groundwork for the coming space age. So you can see how they didn't want the I.G.Y to have a military ring to it. And in fact, there is some evidence of that. So the plan was that Russia and the US were going to try to launch satellites into orbit around the Earth. And that would be done as a part of the International Geophysical Year. And the US had 2 rockets that they could choose from to use. One was from the Army and had Werner von Braun in charge of it. Everybody remembers him, the former German V-2 rocket designer, who just happened to use slave labor camps in order to build these rockets, and he was a major in the Nazi SS. And the other rocket they could use was built by the Naval Research Laboratory. It was called Project Vanguard, and that's where Dr. Odish happened to work. And this had more of a peaceful, non-military ring to it, and it wasn't made up of military scientists. These were civilian scientists, unlike von Braun and his army buddies. And the US wanted to show the world that it could explore space for science and not weapons. And also, they were probably thinking that the public might not be too crazy about the idea that their go-to rocket was developed by the guy that invented the V-2 rocket and is responsible for killing up to 9,000 people in England. So they made the safe choice and went with the Naval Research Laboratory's Vanguard Project rocket. And on the morning of December 6th, they launched the rocket. And it blasted to a height of about 4 feet. And then it lost its thrust, fell back onto the launch pad, and exploded in a ball of fire. The satellite payload was heavily damaged. And to make it worse, this happened just weeks after the Russians had successfully launched Sputnik 1 into orbit. So the media gave it names like Flopnik or Kaputnik. It was nothing less than a huge embarrassment. But it seems to be a fact that the military had a real problem with this Vanguard situation. And they were applying a lot of pressure behind the scenes because they really wanted it to fail. And out of 11 launches, they only had 3 that didn't blow up. And Werner von Braun and his buddies, out of 13 launches, they never had one rocket blow up. Now, they had Apollo 1 catch on fire on the pad, but that wasn't a rocket failure. And there are those that argue that the powers that be had it out for Vanguard, that the system was rigged and they were destined to fail. The military leadership saw Vanguard as a civilian intrusion on what they believed was their rightful domain. So there was no way that the military was not going to get a hold of space. But that's just a clear example of the struggle between the military-industrial complex and the scientists of the world. And speaking of those scientists of the world, let's take a look at the scientists who were behind initiating this International Geophysical Year. It all started in April of 1950 at a dinner party. This was a casual evening party with scientists, drinks, and wide-open conversations. And it was at the home of a guy named James Van Allen. He was an American space physicist, and you may remember him from such things as the Van Allen belt. Yep, he's the guy that discovered them during the I.G.Y. And they are basically two big donut-shaped zones of energy that are wrapped around the Earth. And they protect the Earth by catching harmful radiation from the sun. They're dangerous for satellites and astronauts. Now let's have a look at the guests that were at James's party. There was a guy named Sidney Chapman. He was a British mathematician and geophysicist. Now, in case you're wondering what a geophysicist is, they study things like earthquakes and volcanoes, magnetism, gravity, the atmosphere, what's inside the Earth. So they're fascinated with how this planet actually works. Now, the next guest is Fred Singer. He was an atmospheric physicist. He focused on things like ozone, cosmic rays, and the ionosphere. Next guest, J. Wallace Joyce. He was a scientist administrator. He wasn't so much a field researcher, but he organized and had oversight over scientific projects. And another guy that was there was Ernest Harry Vestine. He was a Canadian geophysicist and meteorologist. And on a side note, his son Harry Vestine will go on to play guitar for Frank Zappa. And now it's time for the last guest on the list. And this guy may be one of the most important ones, or at least the most famous ones, of them all. And his name is Lloyd Berkner. He was a physicist and an engineer. And at the time, his claim to fame was he was the radio engineer on Admiral Richard Byrd's famous expedition to Antarctica in 1929. And in that expedition, Byrd flew over the geographic South Pole, dropped the small American flag, and returned safely. Well, that's quite the party list. It reminds me of Ocean's 11. You know, in those scenes where they're in a hotel room or somewhere having drinks, and each one of them is an expert in their own field, and they're collectively putting their minds together to pull off some huge heist? Well, that's the kind of feeling I get when I imagine that historic dinner party in April of 1950. And what they were talking about and planning was much bigger than any casino heist, because they were talking about how it is time for a new worldwide scientific effort focused on measuring every single part of the world. Now, this idea wasn't original to these scientists, because in 1882 to 1883, they had something called the International Polar Year. And then they had another International Polar Year, again in 1932 to 1933. And in those projects, scientists from around the world got together, went to the poles, measured everything they could, and shared the data. And as the story goes, during after-dinner conversation in the living room, Lloyd Berkner suggested that given advances in technology with rockets and radars since the last International Polar Year in 1933, it was time for a new worldwide scientific effort. But this time, instead of just measuring the poles, they needed to focus on measuring every single thing that they could on the entire planet. And then Sidney Chapman immediately, he supported the idea, and he proposed calling it the International Geophysical Year. And in later years, James Van Allen confirmed this story, but he says that the only thing his house contributed was a living room and some liquid refreshments. And I think that he's probably telling the truth, because there is no way that is how the International Geophysical Year was conceived. There's no way that they thought of this idea while talking freely over drinks, just like in a Hollywood movie. Now, I'm not saying that the party didn't happen. I'm sure it did. But I think it would have sounded more like this. Okay, everyone, we have permission to go ahead. And the powers that be are willing to give us what we need in order to measure the planet and figure out what's going on. Because remember, this was 1950. And these are guys who are basically planetary scientists. They understand and investigate the atmosphere, the ionosphere, the magnetic field. Many of these guys worked with radar in World War II. And starting in 1947, people started seeing these things called flying saucers. When I did my episode on Wilbert Smith, the Canadian government radio engineer, he went to D.C. in 1950 and he began investigating this flying saucer phenomena. He asked around in the Canadian embassy if there was anyone he could talk to that was aware of this. And they were able to set up a meeting with a high-level U.S. defense scientist named Robert Sarbacher. And in that meeting, Smith was told that the UFO subject was classified higher than the H-bomb, that U.S. officials acknowledged that flying saucers are a real phenomena. The craft operated on magnetic principles that were not fully understood, and the top scientists, including von Braun and Oppenheimer, had been consulted on the matter. And he told Wilbur that if he wanted to know more, that basically he needs to go back to his own country and start up a program there, and that he would help. So, Wilbert went back to Canada, and with Robert's help, got the go-ahead to start a project called Project Magnet. And it officially started in December of 1950. Well, that's a coincidence, because in April of 1950 is when the Van Allens had their famous party and thought of the I.G.Y. And when you look into it, there was just a real buzz in the air about flying saucers around that time. The first major story to come out was Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting in 1947. Lots of newspaper articles that eventually grew into magazine articles, and books were starting to be written. Some of them accusing the U.S. military of covering up evidence, even at that time. So to think that these high-level scientists, planetary scientists, getting together would not be talking about anomalies that they've seen. Maybe it was like cosmic ray spikes, ionosphere distortions, radar tracks that were over the polar regions that didn't quite add up. Maybe they even talked about unidentified objects entering and leaving the atmosphere. They would have been well aware that in 1947, the U.S. Air Force started a flying saucer study called Project Sign. It was started after the Kenneth Arnold sightings, and they were trying to determine whether flying saucers were Soviets, secret U.S. tech, or extraterrestrials. Then they shut that down after about a year, and in 1949, the Air Force started Project Grudge, which was kind of a hard pivot. It was basically debunking, downplaying, and trying to psychologically calm the public down, which to me says they found something. And then you have Wilbert Smith in 1950 up in Canada starting Project Magnet, looking into the flying saucer phenomena, funded by the Canadian government and working hand in hand with U.S. Department of Defense scientists and sharing data. To me, to imagine that they were talking about anything else other than things like this is just not rational. And then the fact, like I mentioned earlier, that it was hard to find information about this International Geophysical Year. There wasn't a lot on YouTube about it, and one of the documentaries I had to watch that was kind of informative, I think it was done by a teenage girl for a high school project. So again, I just think that's kind of strange, and that it may indicate that they actually did discover something. And this may have been less about measuring the Earth because we have new technology, and more about making contact. Because remember, from 1947 to 1950, flying saucers were appearing at nuclear labs, nuclear test ranges, nuclear bomber bases, and even Earth's first atomic reactors. And the fear was that this was some type of Soviet breakthrough aircraft, or it was a non-human intelligence monitoring nuclear activity. Plus, I also think these guys would have been well aware of the Foo Fighters. And I'm not talking about the band. I'm talking about the UFO flying saucer type objects that were reported by many World War II fighter pilots. So again, this is April of 1950. But the I.G.Y, it never started until July 1st, 1957, and they went until December 31st, 1958. 18 months. And you might be wondering, if they planned to do it in 1950, why did they wait until July 1st, 1957? Well, they were waiting for solar cycle 19. The scientists knew an 11-year solar peak was coming, solar maximum. And during that time, you have the biggest auroras, the strongest ionospheric changes, and it was the best time to study cosmic rays, magnetism, and was a perfect window for atmospheric and geophysical observations. International Polar Year 1 in 1882 and International Polar Year 2 in 1932 both waited for their solar maximums too. So at this point in history, they were well aware that solar maximum was a great time to measure the planet. And it was also a great time to see how these solar storms would affect their new technology, radio, and measuring equipment. But what I find interesting is that as long as humans have existed, we've been aware of solar maximum cycles. The ancient Chinese were aware of sunspots and auras, and they linked these as omens connected to political stability. The Mesopotamians documented solar anomalies on cuneiform tablets, and they linked unusual solar events to wars, floods, or societal upheavals. In South America, the Maya and the Aztec built solar observatories to track the sun's cycles and eclipses, and they tied the solar cycles to rituals, agriculture, and once again, predictions of societal change. And in the 20th century, the Russian scientist Alexander Tversky tracked the 11-year solar cycles, and he noted that wars, revolutions, and mass social unrest often coincide with solar maximum. He called it cosmic influence on human activity. Or maybe you could boil it down to cosmic influence on human consciousness. And right now, we are in the solar maximum phase of solar cycle 25. So just take a look around. Do you notice any type of societal change? Do you notice any wars, political upheaval, or social unrest? I rest my case. So from 1950, they waited 7 years until July 1st, 1957, which was solar maximum in solar cycle 19. And then the scientists of the world commenced their experiments. And they measured the exact shape of the Earth, gravity variations across the planet, earthquake activity, the deep interior of the planet. They went all over Antarctica. I think they set up something like 12 research stations, including the one that Eric Hecker worked at, the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. They measured Antarctica's ice thickness, the magnetic South Pole. They measured the weather at the poles, possible hidden land masses under the ice. They measured the jet stream, ozone, long-distance radio waves, cosmic rays entering our atmosphere. They also measured space and near-Earth environments. They looked at magnetic storms, auras, and the upper atmosphere and ionosphere. As a part of these measurements and experiments, the Russians got Sputnik up there, and eventually the US got their Explorer satellite up there too. And through their Explorer satellite, they were able to measure radiation in space. And that's where James Van Allen discovered his now famous belt, which, when you look into it, is kind of fascinating, because they discovered that there are huge donut-shaped radiation zones around the Earth. They protect us from the sun's harmful radiation. So really, it's kind of like Earth is shielded by an invisible cosmic armor. And they found that that radiation is very dangerous to astronauts. And on top of that, NASA has never given a clear explanation of how they got past these belts. I like to listen to old Coast to Coast shows with Art Bell. And one time I was listening, and they had Edgar Mitchell on, the Apollo astronaut who's walked on the moon. And people could just call in and ask him a question. So this one guy calls up, and he asks Edgar, "How did you guys get past the Van Allen belt?" So when I heard that, I turned up the volume because I really was interested in what Edgar was going to say. I was curious too. How did they get past that? And what's their explanation? And then Edgar, he lost it. He was furious. He said that it was a long time ago when he couldn't remember, and that means the guy is accusing him of never going to the moon. And that got me wondering, because there are lots of old stories that involve engineers, scientists, or controllers treating rockets as if they need some form of non-technical permission, or some type of ritual blessing before launch. Jack Parsons, the co-founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California that's now under NASA's control, him and his buddy L. Ron Hubbard would perform Babylon working sex magic rituals in the desert to summon an elemental intelligence that would grant permission for humanity to leave Earth. In the 50s and 60s, there were stories about Wernher von Braun too. Some engineers who had worked for him back then said that von Braun half-jokingly often repeated, "We have to ask the little people if they'll let us launch today." Sometimes he'd say, "They're happy today," or other times he'd say, "They're not ready." And in Diana Pasulka's famous book, American Cosmic, she talks about a NASA controller that she knows, who many think is a guy named Tim Taylor, who told her that in the 1990s, he would check with the watchers the night before launch. And when she pressed him on it, he said that certain pads had guardians that would give a sign if it was okay to launch or not. So can you imagine if that's the big secret behind the Van Allen belt? That they have to ask permission or else they'll be fried by the belt? No, I wouldn't be surprised if that's true. Because what it says to me, that is in order for man to leave this planet, he has to acknowledge that he is a spiritual being. And if just that very fact alone was ever admitted to be true by NASA, that would probably knock quite a few ideological keystones out for people. At least I think so. Now, they not only looked out into space, but they also looked deep into the Earth. That's where they came up with the early framework of plate tectonics. Tectonic theory did not exist before the International Geophysical Year. Now, some other things they learned, thanks to Sputnik and Explorer satellite data, they found that the Earth bulges at the equator, and that the planet subtly wobbles, and that gravity isn't uniform. And by having these satellites up into space, and sending more, that was the first global surveillance system. It was the first time humanity had instrumented the entire planet. And they learned that the Earth is connected to the sun. Space is full of radiation. The magnetosphere behaves like a shield, and solar storms can disrupt civilization. Some scientists described seeing strange lights, unexplained polar phenomena, unknown objects tracking near the ionosphere. Of course, those weren't in official reports, but I have no doubt that accounts like that are probably true. But I think one of the most interesting things about this I.G.Y World Measurement Project is that they were all over Antarctica. And it's not like when the 18 months were up that they all packed up shop and went home. They stayed there. The Americans, the Soviets, and the British all built a number of stations that are still there operating today. Because the magnetic field lines converge at the poles, Antarctica is one of the best places to keep an eye on and measure magnetic storms, Earth's magnetic drift, the auroras, the northern lights. Well, I guess they're called southern lights down there. And electrical currents in the upper atmosphere. And this type of research directly connected to the discovery of the Van Allen belts. And because Antarctica has low humidity, strong magnetic activity, and high altitude regions, it makes it the perfect place to detect cosmic rays and atmospheric particles. In other words, space. I find it strange that Antarctica could have contributed so much to man going to space, and we've never heard about it. All the movies that have been made. I used to love the movie The Right Stuff. Not one of them in my memory ever acknowledged Antarctica as contributing to the space program. And nothing much about the International Geophysical Year either. Antarctica is also a great place to find meteorites. The meteorites fall from space, they land on the ice, they don't erode, and they get pushed into something called meteor traps by the glacial flow. And during the I.G.Y program, they discovered many meteorites, including rare ones from the early solar system. And those are just some of the things they discovered through their mapping and measuring of the entire world. And of course, what I've just presented is also the official story that they're really not that interested in telling. You know what? I wonder if maybe the reason they're not that interested in tooting their horn about the I.G.Y program, because if you just look at the sequence of events, the story kind of tells itself. So let's start in 1945. World War II ends with a huge bang, and it thrusts humanity into the atomic age. The Allied powers divvy up the German scientists through Operation Paperclip, and the US gets over 1,000 of them to themselves. and they put them straight to work on stuff that's still classified to this day. Then in 1946, during the Antarctica summer, they send down Operation High Jump, headed up by Admiral Byrd, who had already been to the South Pole many times. And he went down there with 4,700 sailors and scientists, 13 ships, including an aircraft carrier, and 33 airplanes. The operation was planned for around 6 to 8 months, but after around 5 months, they came home early. Their excuse was that winter was rapidly setting in and they had to get out of there. And on their way back to the U.S., he did an interview with a Chilean newspaper called El Mercurio, because Byrd wasn't just any regular admiral. He was a famous polar pioneer. And on their way home in 1947, he did an interview on the deck of his Navy command ship. Now I'm going to read you some lines from this interview. Now just listen to this with a bit of an open mind. And it says, Admiral Richard E. Byrd warned today that the United States should adopt measures of protection against the possibility of an invasion of the country by hostile planes coming from polar regions. The Admiral explained that he was not trying to scare anyone, but the cruel reality is that in a case of a new war, the United States could be attacked by planes flying over one or both poles. The article goes on to say that the fantastic speed with which the world is shrinking, recalled the Admiral, is one of the most important lessons learned during this recent Antarctic exploration. I have to warn my compatriots that the time has ended when we were able to take refuge in our isolation and rely on the certainty that the distances, the oceans, and the poles were a guarantee of safety. Now, does that sound like somebody that went to the South Pole to have a look around and had to leave early because of bad weather? For crying out loud, the guy had been there like 4 or 5 times already at this point. Or does that sound like somebody that went down there and discovered something? And that reminds me of a conversation I had with a guy that I worked with for a very short time a few years ago. He had mentioned to me that he had been in the military when he was younger. And I thought that was interesting. So I asked him what he did. And he said that he was a combat engineer. So he worked with technical stuff. Radars and radios and weapon systems, things like that. So I said to him, I'm interested in UFO type stuff. Did you ever see anything? And he got a very serious look on his face. And he said to me, all I can say is this. We were in the Arctic, and we were working with some type of acoustic technology. And that's all I can say. And I asked, well, did you see something? And he said, I can't say anything more about it. That I have to take what happened to my grave. So as I've been looking into Antarctica the past month or so, I've been reminded of the one guy I ever talked to who actually was in the polar regions doing some type of experimental acoustic technology. Had something happened that he has sworn to secrecy about. And now I'm wondering, did he detect or see craft coming in from the polar regions that Byrd was talking about? Who knows? Now let's look at what the gist of Byrd was trying to say in that interview. He's saying that the United States could no longer rely on the old idea that distance and oceans would keep us safe. The world has shrunk. He warned that hostile aircraft could come from polar regions and possibly invade the U.S., and that they needed to adopt measures of protections against this possibility. And then he says, I'm not trying to scare anybody, but the cruel reality is that in a case of a new war, the U.S. could be attacked by planes flying over one or both poles? And for years, people have said that Richard Byrd actually said flying objects which could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. Now, many say that's a mistranslation or taken out of context or something, But guaranteed, if he actually did say that to that Chilean newspaper reporter, they would do everything they could to discredit it. But either way, they definitely saw something down there, and they were very alarmed. And remember, this was in March of 1947. And then, in July of 1947, there would be a crash of a strange craft in Roswell, New Mexico. Now, can you imagine if the craft that crashed in Roswell, New Mexico is what Byrd was trying to warn everybody about? Did this enter Earth's atmosphere from the South Pole? It's kind of funny timing, really. And then after that, they started up the CIA and the Air Force. And then throughout the 50s, there was what many call a UFO flap. Flying saucers were seen all over the world. And for a couple weeks in 1952, they were seen over top of the White House and the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. There were all kinds of radar and pilot sightings. And by the mid to late 50s, you started hearing about people being abducted and being contacted with pilots of these flying saucers. You had many government flying saucer programs looking into what these things are. That's a fact. And then in July 57, you have the start of the International Geophysical Year, where the whole world decides to get along and measure the entire planet. Then, about a year later, in July of 1958, NASA's created. And NASA's always touted as America's civilian space program. But many say, when you dig real deep into that fine print, it's actually just a military in disguise. Which would kind of make sense, considering the struggle between the Vanguard project and Wernher von Braun and his army buddies. And now let's look at what happened after the I.G.Y. was over. A little less than 1 year from the end date of the I.G.Y., on December 1st, 1959, there was a treaty signed. And this treaty had to do with Antarctica. And the purpose of this treaty was to ensure that Antarctica is only used for peaceful purposes, and that it prohibits military activity and promotes scientific cooperation. The original signatories were 12 countries, and the key points are that no territorial claims are recognized while the treaty is enforced, and that military activity, nuclear tests, and disposal of radioactive waste are banned, and scientific research and international cooperation are encouraged. I think that's kind of strange. So the only two places in the world where everybody can just get along is the South Pole and space. Well, maybe the South Pole and space are one and the same. Now, in order to keep pulling on this International Geophysical Year thread, I'm going to focus on who many call the father of the International Geophysical Year. And that guy is Lloyd Berkner. He was at that famous James Van Allen party, and he is right in the middle of the scientific elite. And like I had mentioned earlier, in his early 20s, he was the radio man for Richard Byrd's Antarctic expedition, where in 1929 he flew across the continent for the first time ever. Then in 1950, we see Berkner helping round up scientists to prepare for the 1957-1958 International Geophysical Year. And one of his tasks was helping them decide where to go in Antarctica during this I.G.Y. And it makes me wonder if Admiral Byrd and Lloyd Berkner discovered something there in 1929. And Lloyd, being the radio man, maybe he detected strange anomalies or got very bizarre readings. And now was their time to go back there and take a closer look. And remember how I mentioned that at that famous party, There's no way that these planetary scientists wouldn't have been discussing the UFO flap phenomena that was happening all over the world? Well, in 1953, something was created called the Robertson Panel. Now, this was a secret scientific committee convened by the CIA and other three-letter agencies, and they were reviewing reports of unidentified flying objects that had surged in 1952, especially around Washington, D.C. And the conclusion they came to was they found no evidence that UFOs represented a direct physical or military threat, but they did recommend a public debunking campaign to try and strip UFOs of the mystery they had around them, and to try and reduce mass public concern. And Lloyd Berkner was listed among the scientists that were on that Robertson panel. I mean, it only makes sense, really. If they really wanted to investigate what was going on in the upper atmosphere, they would have the country's foremost expert. And of course, that would be him. And so throughout the 1950s, Lloyd spent most of his time planning and international coordination around the International Geophysical Year. He was one of the primary planners and organizers. He worked closely with international scientific councils, and he had different scientific advisory roles. He would contribute technical advice on upper atmosphere physics, radar, and geophysical instrumentation. He helped plan site selection for the Antarctica I.G.Y program, and he was also involved with a place called Brookhaven National Laboratory. It was a laboratory for the U.S. Government Atomic Energy Commission, and it's about 60 miles east of New York City, and he had different types of administrative and oversight responsibility. And he was there all throughout the 50s too. And this place just so happens to be where many think there are black project programs going on there. It's been rumored for years that they are up to something there. And on the Joe Rogan podcast, episode 1945, even Eric Weinstein said, if there is a Manhattan-type project that the government doesn't want anyone to know about, it's probably at Brookhaven National Laboratories. Boy, that kind of gives that conspiracy theory some credibility. So I think it's clear that Lloyd Berkner was part of the scientific elite, and he straddled two worlds, part scientist, part military government liaison. So he was placed right in the middle of the science-military struggle, which history proves that depending on where your loyalties lie, that can be quite the dangerous place to be. In around 1962, Berkner left the Brookhaven National Laboratory, and he moved to Dallas, Texas, to become involved with something called the GRCSW, Graduate Research Center of the Southwest. The center was attracting national scientific figures so that they could drum up federal support, especially in fields like physics, geophysics, and applied scientists. So having a giant like Lloyd from the science community would have been no small feat. So Lloyd was brought in to oversee operations, and his tasks included managing budgets, coordinating research programs, and leveraging federal contacts to support local science initiatives. He basically acted as a bridge between the Dallas-based science institution and national agencies. And according to a 2013 issue of the University of Texas magazine, they had an article in it stating that there is a less well-known connection between the Graduate Center of the Southwest and the 1963 JFK presidential visit to Dallas. It said that the leadership had drafted up plans for the possible visit of President John F. Kennedy to the Graduate Research Center. It was not quite 2 years old at the time. and the center was ready to stake its claim in the Science and Technology Center. And it said that the center's leadership, including Lloyd Berkner, were faced with the realities of planning around an ever-shifting presidential itinerary. But eventually the campus visit was scrapped, and the center became the lead sponsor of the main event, a luncheon at the Dallas Trade Mart. But to make the most of the moment in the national spotlight, the leadership had 3 options for consideration. The most elaborate of the plans would require a helicopter, a military honor guard, and a high school band. The proposal had Kennedy presenting to Lloyd Berkner a flag that had flown over the nation's capital. The flag would be couriered from the site of the presentation at the Dallas Trade Mart via helicopter to the Graduate Research Campus. A closed-circuit broadcast from campus would show the courier being met by the honor guard and band awaiting Kennedy's command to raise the colors with the new flag. Geez, that's pretty elaborate. So they had proposed Kennedy presenting a flag that was flown over the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., to Lloyd Berkner. That's interesting. And in this article, it says that there was another plan. And this one drew from the World War II military service that linked Kennedy and Berkner. It goes on to say that Kennedy famously commanded a U.S. Navy patrol boat, PT-109, in the Pacific. And Berkner, as a rear admiral in the U.S. Naval Reserve, gained global recognition for the scientific breakthroughs he fostered. Basically, he was a military scientist who did all kinds of stuff with radar. In this scenario, Kennedy would present to Berkner a ship's bell, engraved with a quotation from Kennedy's 1960 inaugural address. The thousands in attendance at the luncheon, including national journalists, would then get a glimpse of the center through the film clips of the October dedication of the building known today as Founders. And the third idea they had for the meeting with Kennedy that day was one in which Kennedy would talk about the Graduate Research Center at the beginning of his scheduled speech at the Dallas Trade Mart. All the center's scientists and their spouses received invitations to the luncheon so that they could hear the president publicly acknowledge the value of the work that they were conducting. But the article goes on to say that fate intervened that day. Of course, Kennedy was shot on his way to the Trade Mart in his car. And they wonder, what if they had gone with the plan to have a helicopter land on the campus of the Graduate Research Center? Would the course of world history be changed? And it says that there were after effects felt in Dallas after the assassination. The research center had sponsored a conference called Gravitational Collapse and Other Topics in Relativistic Astrophysics. And after the JFK assassination, people began to cancel. Scientists were afraid to come to Dallas, that it was dangerous. And the center began sending telegrams, cables, and radio messages to let everybody know that they would not be endangered by coming to Dallas. So, this is not a conspiracy theory. This is a fact. That the day that JFK was shot, he was on his way to an event at the Dallas Trade Mart where Lloyd Berkner was the guest of honor. And he was going to give a speech that explicitly praised the Graduate Research Center and Berkner's leadership, calling it one of the most advanced scientific institutes in the world, and highlighting its role in America's space program. Now the question is, what exactly was he going to say in this speech? I mean, Lloyd Berkner is no slouch. He is an elite in the scientific community. Remember, he was Admiral Byrd's radio man in the first ever flyover of the South Pole. And oddly enough, the guy that owned the Texas School Book Depository that Kennedy was shot out of, When Oswald was leaning out the window, popping him off, supposedly. Well, that building just happened to be owned by David Harold Byrd, Admiral Richard Byrd's cousin. He was a rich Texas oil man. Boy, small world, eh? He also happened to be good buddies with Lyndon Johnson. Oh, and he also took the sniper's window out of his book depository building after the assassination, and he hung it in his house. Well, that's strange. Now back to Lloyd. He was also considered the father of the International Geophysical Year. He sat on the Robertson panel to have a closer look at this UFO phenomena. He was an administrator at Brookhaven National Labs, where all of this buzz is about top secret black project programs are there. And he had recently moved to Dallas to help start up this new graduate research center, and Kennedy was about to call it one of the most advanced scientific institutions in the world. All the while, the center was lobbying for JFK to boost the center's profile amid the space race. Of course, after Kennedy's death, they released a speech, which some say that this speech doesn't really fit with what Kennedy would normally say. It kind of gives Charlie Kirk vibes. After the assassination, everyone's trying to put words in your mouth, if you know what I mean. Now, before I start to open up the door of what this speech may have been about, let's just broadly look at this one more time. There has always been a struggle between civilian science and the military. The recent movie Oppenheimer clearly portrays this struggle. Anyone that questions or has a conscience is left out in the cold, or worse. And during the International Geophysical Year, we could see the struggle between the civilian scientist Vanguard project and Wernher von Braun and his army buddies. And eventually, von Braun and his army buddies won. They were not using Vanguard project rockets for the Apollo program. And then we see Lloyd Berkner leave his tenure at the Brookhaven National Laboratories, a place that has always been suspected of being connected to black military government DOD type projects. And he moves to Dallas to become a part of this new graduate research center that was lobbying to boost its profile amid the space race. And the day that Kennedy was shot, he was on his way to the Dallas Trade Mart, where Lloyd Berkner was the guest of honor, and he was about to make a speech. Or maybe he was going to make some type of announcement. I mean, really, if the Institute was considering having a flag that was flown in D.C., taken via helicopter from Kennedy to the Institute, and then rose up on a flagpole, and then have some type of honor guard and television, to me, that sounds like something more than just a speech. That sounds more like an announcement. And this is where Dark Journalist comes in. Now, Dark Journalist, aka Daniel List, is an independent investigative reporter. And I highly recommend checking out his YouTube channel. Now, he's been investigating this topic for years and was my inspiration to try and put it into a podcast. And he thinks that President Kennedy was assassinated in part because he was attempting to expose and take control of a secret parallel government running a highly classified rogue aerospace program. One that may have even had advanced anti-gravity technology. And that speech that he never got to give was going to make some type of alliance between the government and the Graduate Research Center, and that it was going to shift the power away from the military, black budget, top secret need-to-know basis programs and place the power in the hands of civilian scientists. And even worse, not just the civilian scientists in America, but the civilian scientists of the world. After all, Lloyd Berkner is referred to as the father of the International Geophysical Year, which is a civilian science project of the world. And I think that perspective is very reasonable. Let's think about it. How many presidents have ever given a speech against secret societies? Well, none that lived, but JFK did. And in that speech, he says stuff like, the very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and that we are as a people inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. And he talks about how that there is this battle behind the scenes on basically a group that he says primarily relies on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, and on intimidation instead of free choice. And he says that this system has conscripted vast human material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Boy, sounds to me like JFK had been listening to some Catherine Austin Fitz or something. And then he says, its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, and no secret is revealed. Now that right there is the best description I've ever heard of the breakaway civilization, and that was given 64 years ago. Kennedy gave that speech in 1961, 2 weeks after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. And it's speeches like that that make people think that he was not under the control of this breakaway civilization. And there's something else. On November 12, 1963, just 10 days before his assassination, Kennedy signed something called Cooperation with the USSR on Outer Space Matters. In it, he directed NASA Administrator James Webb to assume personal responsibility for developing a concrete program of joint U.S.-Soviet ventures. Then the top priority was a joint manned lunar landing. So, putting men on the moon together. And in fact, in September of 1963, he gave a speech at the United Nations, and he said, "Why should man's first flight of the moon be a matter of national competition? I include among these possibilities a joint expedition to the moon." I could just imagine all the spit takes going on when people heard that. Yeah, that's what the DoD wants. Peace with Russia. Now back to the speech that he never made with Lloyd Berkner. Was he about to announce a strategic partnership between the U.S. government and the Graduate Research Center about going to space? Was he going to announce a joint venture to the moon with Russia? And was he going to announce that humanity is not alone? Remember the speech that Dr. Hugh Odish gave at the end of the I.G.Y, his speech entitled The Meaning of the International Geophysical Year. And in that speech, he said that the I.G.Y was as significant to humanity as the Copernican Revolution. And he warned about the dangers and complexity of modern society hiding what they've discovered, and through that, masking the wonders of the earth and the universe. Maybe he was referring to the fact that there is some type of presence in Antarctica. And maybe that the International Geophysical Year was some type of contact event. And maybe that's what JFK was aware of. And when you look at it from that perspective, it looks like Kennedy was on his way to knock out the ideological keystone by him announcing an international and civilian effort to go to space and admit that man is not alone in the universe. And if that's true, I can see why they've never fully released the JFK files, because fully releasing those files would undo reality as we know it. Can you imagine if that's what they've been hiding all of these years? That it's not about protecting the CIA or Israel or covering up for the mob, but it's to keep the truth about reality hidden from humanity. Now, with that in mind, listen to this conversation between Chris Cuomo and Tucker Carlson on his podcast.
In January, there was a scramble over who's going to get what jobs in the new administration. And at one point, there was someone who was being discussed for a job in the intel world, and a member of the SSCI, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and Intel Committee, went to the people making the decision and said, you cannot hire this person because this person will be certain to push for the release of the JFK files. You have a sitting member of the United States Senate whose main goal is to keep those files secret. And then you have to ask yourself, why?
Yeah.
Exactly. Why?
So why don't you expose that person, first of all, so we can start chasing
Tom
after
Cotton
him?
of Arkansas did that.
Tom Cotton?
Yes.
So Tom Cotton, eh? Whether it's a Catholic cardinal or the Pope himself or a senator from Arkansas, they will not willingly surrender our worldview. Just like the Copernican revolution. Oh, the church used the math all right. They used the Copernican model, but they couldn't bring themselves to officially admit that the earth is not the center of the universe for 300 years. And now we may be in the same dilemma, that through the I.G.Y, the governments of the earth may have made contact. They may have come to the understanding that we are not alone and that man is not the center of the universe. And by admitting that very fact alone, religions and authoritarian type systems would collapse. That it would be the final nail in the coffin of materialism, and that we would be confronted with the fact that we are spiritual beings. Now back to Lloyd Berkner. Whatever happened to good old Lloyd? If he really was straddling the elite science community and the elite military-industrial complex community, that's quite the predicament to be in. Because the DoD companies would be well aware that Lloyd has knowledge that could ruin their party. And if he really was planning with Kennedy to help launch an international space effort, and even spill the beans about reality itself, things don't usually end up well for people like that. Well, after the assassination, he continued to work at the Graduate Research Center, and in 1964, he suffered a serious heart attack, which caused him to slow down on many of his activities at the center. But he never fully retired. Even after the heart attack, he continued his studies on Earth's atmosphere and planetary atmospheres. In 1966, he was awarded the highest civilian honor from NASA, the NASA Distinguished Public Service Medal, and it was for his contributions to U.S. space science. But in 1967, Berkner died in Washington, D.C. he had a heart attack while attending a meeting of National Academy of Sciences. He was only 62 years old. And at the time of his death, he was reportedly conducting a study for NASA on the history of Earth's and Mars' atmospheres. And when you look into it, you'll find that NASA was a lot more serious about going to Mars than we're aware of. And in fact, if you listen to 30-year Israeli space security chief Hayam Eshed, in his 2020 book, he wrote that humanity is already on Mars and that the US has a joint base with aliens or something. You know, there's always been this saying that the government just can't keep secrets. But really, they don't have to hide the secrets. They just have to keep us from believing that those secrets are true. So it's not so much about concealing information, but it's about managing belief. But our belief managers, I mean the government, are no dummies. So in 1960, they had a Washington, D.C. think tank do a study for them. And that think tank was called the Brookings Institute. And their study was titled, Proposed Studies on the Implications of Peaceful Space Activities for Human Affairs. Now, out of that whole study, there's one page or so that's been talked about for over 60 years. And this page has the heading, The Implications of a Discovery of Extraterrestrial Life. And it says things like, well, face-to-face meetings with extraterrestrial life will not occur within the next 20 years, unless its technology is more advanced than ours, qualifying it to visit Earth. Duh. I'm sure its technology is more advanced than ours. And it goes on to say that artifacts left at some point in time by these life forms might possibly be discovered through our space activities on the Moon, Mars, or Venus. And it also says, anthropological files contain many examples of societies sure of their place in the universe, which have disintegrated when they had to associate with previously unfamiliar societies espousing different ideas and different ways of life. Others that survived and eventually flourished after such contact made a greater effort at understanding. Do you see what that's saying? That's saying that human societies that are completely confident in their worldview can fall apart when confronted with a radically different culture, especially one that challenges their beliefs or sense of identity. And it goes on to say, the history shows many examples of civilizations collapsing, basically after they had their ideological keystones knocked out, and meeting more advanced or unfamiliar groups. But then it says, some societies do survive the encounter, and the ones that succeed are the ones that make a conscious effort to understand the new ideas instead of resisting them. Well, I have to say, I don't think they're wrong. Now, back to the report. It also says that it has been speculated that of all groups, religious fundamentalists might be the most affected by the discovery of extraterrestrial life or artifacts. And it is possible that the discovery of life beyond Earth would have major psychological consequences for some segments of the population, and the matter is therefore worth considering in advance. Well, there you have it. It would be the end of the world, as we know it at least. Now, is there any other evidence that would suggest that Kennedy was about to expose the truth about reality, and that he was going to go forward with some type of disclosure to the public? Well, you know, there is. Because there was a guy named Douglas Caddy. Now, he was the attorney who initially represented the Watergate burglars in the early 70s. And in 2018, Douglas wrote a book called Being There, Eyewitness to History. And in the book, he talks about how one of the burglars that he represented was a former CIA officer, and his name was Howard E. Hunt. And in 1975, Caddy was having dinner with Howard, and he asked, why was Kennedy assassinated? And according to Caddy, Hunt replied that JFK was going to give the Soviets our most vital secret. And when Caddy pressed him on what exactly that secret was, Hunt leaned in and he told him the alien presence.